My name's Cody, and today I'm going to be talking about deaf culture and the deaf community. So, deaf people, they're extremely unique in the way that they have their own culture, they have their own language, and they have their own community. But they've also faced lots of setbacks due to their disability, as hearing people would suggest. So, first, deaf culture is similar to any other culture. They're celebrated in the world. They identify with their deafness despite their circumstances. They have their own culture in the same way that Native Americans or African Americans have that culture and that bond with one another. Despite many people thinking that deafness is a disability, it's something that deaf people embrace. Their lack of being able to hear, it doesn't define who they are. It actually strengthens their character in most cases, and they're proud of who they are. In the deaf community, some people may align themselves into two categories. So there is capital D deaf, which means that those are people who were born deaf. They were born without the ability to hear, or those people lost their hearing at a very young age and they didn't develop communication yet. Lowercase d deaf are people who were hearing and they lost their hearing. Often older people or people that are already developed in their communication, so they don't see deafness as a part of their identity the way that profoundly deaf people do. There's an article called What is the Big D and the Little D, which refers to those two categories. It's important to note that deafness is a spectrum, so not all deaf people identify with these categories, but it's talking about that people who identify as uppercase D, the big D, deaf, profoundly deaf people, they're highly against cochlear implants. They're highly against hearing aids because they see it as something that takes away their identity, that they're not proud of their deafness. They advocate for people to go against cochlear implants and hearing aids. Just like any other culture, there are requirements to be a part of it. So, just like that, in the deaf community, most people need to fit two sets of criteria: a sufficient degree of hearing loss and a proficiency in sign language. Severity of their hearing loss and being able to sign are the biggest factors when it comes to being a part of the deaf culture. Severe deafness at birth, it makes you an immediate candidate for membership. But those who lose their hearing later on in life due to aging or circumstances are less likely to become members of the deaf culture and the deaf community. So deaf people, they use sign language to communicate with one another. There's many different kinds of sign language because it's not a universal language. In the United States, ASL is used, which is American Sign Language. ASL is a visual, grammatically complex language with no vocal components. However, some people who are comfortable using their voice, they do so. But most often it's just with their hands and expressed with their facial expressions. Sign language improves expressive communication because when signing's taking place, not only are words being expressed, but their feelings are also being expressed in a visible way. ASL also reduces frustration in the deaf community because it takes pressure off trying to hear and being a part of a conversation with too many things happening at once. When it comes to the deaf community, they face exclusion on a daily basis, such as being denied access to interpreters in public spaces. They face setbacks because they live in a world full of hearing people that don't try to understand their circumstances. They don't try to accommodate them. Society has a lack of fluency in ASL and understanding the deaf community, so that brings its challenges regarding employment, higher education, healthcare, and so on and so forth. Setbacks such as a lack of participation greatly affects the deaf community because they face certain instances that they would love to be a part of, but hearing people reject deaf people because they can't communicate. So that gives deaf people a sense of inferiority and insecurity with their identity. They often feel excluded from opportunities and they go relatively unnoticed because their disability it's not visible. Deaf people are often marginalized because they have to use interpreters in certain instances, and so personal information can be given out when they're not comfortable giving that personal information to a stranger. Also, profoundly deaf children are at a disadvantage when it comes to reading because reading is based on the phonological code of our language. For example, learning to read in English, it's based on sound. So that makes it extremely difficult for deaf children to understand proper English grammar. Probably one of the biggest setbacks that the deaf community faces is when it comes to technology in our modern society. Technology is the most advanced it's ever been, but in light of social media, movie theaters, and so on and so forth, it lacks for the deaf community. Closed captions are often not provided for deaf people, and when they are, they can be auto generated, making it difficult to read them. And the deaf and hearing community are completely different. For almost 100 years after the invention of the telephone, it separated deaf people from the rest of society because deaf people can't use a phone. And now it's better, but still we have a lot of work to do when it comes to accommodating the deaf community. So to say all this, the deaf culture and the deaf community in itself is extremely unique because they have their own culture, just like ethnic groups do. They have their own language. They have their own community. It's a personal bond with one another because they have that connection, they have that closeness. They don't look at their deafness as a disability, they don't look at it as something that affects their life per se, and most oftentimes they are proud of their identity with being deaf. But there are still certain things that the hearing world should be better about accommodating for the deaf community. We should be better at trying to communicate with them. ASL, it's a language in itself. Yes, it has grammatical, complex tone, dialect, and slang, but just learning the basics of sign language could just help somebody feel comfortable in their own world. And just with technology, we need to be better at giving closed captioning, accommodating deaf people at drive-throughs, movie theaters, in that aspect. Deaf people are people too, and they deserve to be heard and they matter.